Yeah, talk a bit about that.
I left Peterborough on March 4th, 2001. And I believe I flew from Toronto to, I think I flew from Toronto to Vancouver. Anyway, I landed in Osaka, the Kansai International Airport. And I remember on the plane, it was a very long plane ride. It may have been, 16 or 17 hours or 18 hours in total. And I remember watching the movies and listening to Eric Clapton CDs and sort of thinking about, questioning what have I done. That was honestly, that was in the plane. I was questioning, I was thinking, what have I done and why am I doing this? And I thought, sort of worst case scenario, if it doesn't happen, I can always take the next plane home. So I was initially, quite anxious. And I landed in Osaka, and I was all alone. There was no one there to greet me. There was just me in the airport. And I was lucky that there were English signs and there was English information as to where to go and all this kind of thing. But I collected my baggage and I took the airport express train from Osaka to Kyoto. Now, I didn't have a hotel reserved. I didn't have any accommodations reserved. I was just completely on the fly. And so I went from the airport to Kyoto. I think the plane arrived in Osaka at maybe 5 o'clock or 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And I took the train to Kyoto, and I arrived at maybe 7 o'clock or 7:30. And I was taking the train from Osaka to Kyoto, and I was just amazed by how many structures there were, how developed the country. All along the train, I could see houses, office buildings, development. And this was very new to me because in Peterborough, in this central Ontario, you have, if you take a long trip, you will see farmland and forest and rural areas. There was nothing rural. It was everything. There was nothing but development for the whole train ride, the 1 hour and a half train ride. So my first observation was Japan is a very urbanized society and very technologically advanced society. I arrived in Kyoto at maybe 7:30 p.m., no hotel accommodations, didn't know where I was, had no map, nothing. So I left the station, and I was kind of surprised because Kyoto is supposedly it's an older city, and yet...
Sorry, were you on a visitor's visa, or how did you get in?
I had a working holiday visa, and my initial intention was to stay in Japan for at least a year, possibly 3 years, and not longer than 3 years. But at least I wanted to make an effort to try to stay for at least 1 year. I didn't have any serious job in Canada. I didn't have any study plan in Canada. I wanted to try something new. I wanted to go somewhere different. I had stayed in Israel and Denmark, and I enjoyed being in a new culture, being in a new environment. So I wanted to try living on my own, independently in another country, in a very different country. So I chose Japan. It was either Japan or Korea. And so I settled on Japan because Japan seemed to be somewhat Western, but also somewhat Eastern. And so I could find a McDonald's or something if I...
And did you have a job lined up?
I did organize a job. Through a family connection, I found an English school in Kyoto, and I organized a job. I didn't have a guaranteed job, but I had it very well networked. So I assumed that I would have it, and I had about 5,000 Canadian dollars in traveler's checks that I could use for a few months to survive, to eat before the job began to pay me my salary. So I definitely had a plan.
And did you get your work visa on the strength of a letter from or some sort of invitation to come to the school, or was that not necessary to get that?
In my case,
visa?
I was lucky the visa was separate from employment. The working holiday visa between Japan and Canada allows younger people to stay in the country and find work wherever. So the visa is really the individual's visa and not the employer's visa. And so I had that, I was lucky to have that independence. But I networked a job at an English school, and I kind of arrived in Kyoto City, and it was March 5th, 2001, and it was getting dark and kind of, I was a little bit worried, where am I going to stay, where am I going to sleep? I had no plans at all. And so I just went to the nearest hotel, and I asked them, excuse me, please give me the cheapest room that you have for a single person, the cheapest that you have. And they wrote the price, and I said, okay, I accepted it. And I went to the room, and I was interested. The room was very narrow and very small, which I thought was very interesting and very, kind of comfortable, rather than a large room. And it was on the upper floor, maybe on the 5th floor, and I could look down at the station and look down at the streets below. And I was surprised to see how many pedestrians would cross the street, how much activity there was on that street, in that area. And the other thing that struck me is the bathtub. When I went to the bathroom, the bathtub was very small but very deep. And this is the Japanese style of taking a bath, of being fully immersed in water. So I think initially I didn't really, I was a little bit, I kind of expected kimonos and old Japan and the old traditional sort of stereotypes that you hear about Japan. I expected that, and there was nothing. I expected old buildings and everything was new. So there was initially quite a shock. And the other shock was food was very expensive, but tobacco was very cheap. So I began to smoke more. That was the other big change. But I didn't have, I think it was when I was introduced to the English school, and I had to find my way around Kyoto on my own. And having to...
Are there English signs all over it? A town like, a city like Kyoto?
The signs are written in Chinese kanji, and they're written in Romanji. They're written in Roman letters. And so you can read the Roman letters. However, I don't know if I had a map, but I didn't... initially, the bus system, the train system, the street system was difficult. Now, I was lucky. Osaka and Tokyo are much more complex. Kyoto is a city of 1 million people, so it's not such a complex city, and the streets are on the grid system, and so it's easier than other cities. So, and it's a tourist city, so there are lots of information for visitors. So I was very lucky in that sense. But I just remember the feeling of being by myself in a kind of a very rapidly moving, very active country, very busy country, with having very little, I guess, support or information. There was the school's head teacher, who I stayed in his apartment for maybe 4 days, and he kind of explained Kyoto, and he explained a little bit about Japan, and I met other Western English teachers through the school, and I could learn from them. But my other challenge was I didn't know how to teach English. I had no idea how to teach. So I didn't know anything about Japan, and I didn't know anything about teaching. And so I had to learn in a very short period of time how to do this right. And I had assistants. I wasn't completely on my own, but I had assistants, but I never really had, like, when you're anxious and when you're sometimes panicking, it's very difficult to learn things. The mind and the body is not, learning becomes more difficult when you're in that fight or flight response. And if you're that way a lot, then it becomes very difficult to learn and adapt to whatever context you're in. So there is a need for some. I was in Japan, and for the first 3 months, it was really bloody hard. Like, really, I was emailing and contacting my parents, and I said, even after I was settled, even after I had my house and my apartment, I lived in
your own apartment.
I lived in a rooming house. I lived in a rooming house for a year, and I paid by the month. I had one private room. First, the dormitory with other people, and then I rented a private room, and there were Japanese and Western people, students, tourists, mostly people who stayed for maybe a month or 3 weeks. So there was always a turnover, these, German people coming in, and then they would leave, and French people coming in. So it was kind of like a melting, cultural melting not a melting pot, but kind of like the UN in Kyoto. And that was for 1 year. But for the first 3 months, even with my accommodations and basic necessities organized, I felt it was still very stressful to adapt to the country and also adapt to teaching English and learning how to do that. So the first 3 months for me were really, really hard, and I was really almost ready to go home. And I was thinking, I had a 1 year open ticket, so I could go home at any time. There was no, my visa, there was no limitations. I could go home at any time. But I kept I don't know why, but I just kept making effort to try to stay in Kyoto. And I think after 3 months it got easier. But the first 3 months were the most difficult. And I would say after 6 months, things got easier, I would say. And after a year, I think things were easier.
That's just because you figured out a lot of stuff that you didn't have to
yes.
think about so hard.
Part of it is technical, and part of it is also emotional, because you need to realize a lot about yourself, and you need to mature as a person in a foreign context, in another context. And so it's partly also learning about the self and learning how you perceive things, how you react, how you a lot of it is perceptions and managing, I guess. A lot of it is you need to grow as a person to be able to successfully live in a foreign country.
That's a very good point, to manage yourself and your emotions.
Yes, even now I find I learn, for example, if I watch Japanese TV and if I feel that the programs are somewhat xenophobic or kind of negative. For example, if the program is mocking foreigners or mocking women or mocking minorities, then I feel it's more difficult to be optimistic, to function in the society. So I kind of respond by doing a lot of cardiovascular exercise, by doing weight training, by being very careful about my eating, alcohol consumption. And so that's one thing I've learned about myself. I also don't watch TV, and so that's the other thing. So you have to I have to be aware of what I can be exposed to and what I should not be exposed to. I have to be aware of tendencies within my own personality to avoid certain study, for example.
Yeah, I think that's very useful. I think that you talk about the psychology, the personal psychology
Yes.
of it. That's great.
Yes.
But talk a bit about how you were treated, or how Japanese people related to you.
Right.
How you felt in relation to them, and just the treatment too. Was it neutral? Was it negative? Were there negative experiences? Were there some positive? Or what happened to you?
Right.
As you encountered every day mostly Japanese people?
I think first of all, I must say that as a Westerner in Japan, I'm in a very privileged position. I was always aware of that because during the Meiji period of development, the Westerners were seen as being the people who had knowledge, the German engineers and the British and the French and the Danish. And even in Kobe now,
through, you think?
I think it's still there.
Yeah.
And so I think people who are white and from countries like Canada, the United States, Europe, they're seen as being different, but positive. They bring knowledge, they bring benefit, they are successful, they represent success. Even just the face represents success, wealth, prosperity, and technology and progress. And so the Japanese, since the Meiji period, have looked to the West for development, and they've been, I think the Japanese, to an extent, see themselves as being almost like the white people of Asia. And so I think they developed faster than Korea, than China. So that's part of the modern identity that's connected. Well, I shouldn't say part of. Maybe it's connected to the modern identity, view, perspective of Japanese. So I was very lucky.
That as you interact with Japanese people, you feel that there's a positive
Yes.
tenor to it, that you belong to a group that is respected.
But only often on a skin deep level, and so only often on the very superficial level. So some students will say, for example, I remember in Japanese, some students were saying, his eyes are really blue, or not so much my hair, because I was blonder when I was younger, but the sort of the blue eyes is, no one has blue eyes in Japan. So that was one point. My height would be another point. That kind of thing, but it's not on any deep level. It's just somewhat superficial, and you see this often with children who are of mixed backgrounds, who are half Western and half Japanese. They're very, very exotic, and they're very, very kind of interesting personalities, but not necessarily not accepted as being Japanese, or not as given, I would say, given a special status within the other, given a special place within the other, but still within the other, because they would say that, these foreigners cannot understand our unique Japanese culture. I mean, I have to be very careful not to be negative about Japan, because what you see in Japan is often the same that you would see in any culture, with the exception that the Japanese are still a rather homogeneous country, and they have no recent memory of immigration. And so they see themselves as being a country not of immigrants, but of an ethnic, cultural majority, and the Japanese family, the Japanese view their country in the same way as they view their family. So in the Japanese family unit, there's not a lot of mixing with other people. You mostly stay with your family. First of all, there's yourself, and there's your father and mother and your children and your grandparents and your aunts and uncles. And that's really, it's almost the nuclear family, and sometimes the extended family to include the grandparents only. But the family is very insular, because there is a fear of the other. There's a fear of the outside person. And so you don't go to your neighbor's house for dinner. You don't go to a Christmas party at your friend's house. As a group, you don't have these large dinners in someone's house. You would have a dinner at a restaurant, because you would be too ashamed to show your house, especially your kitchen, to someone who is not in your immediate family. So it's a kind of the family unit is very insular, and so the country reflects that family understanding. And so I don't look at Japan and think like Japan is a more racist country than other countries. I think Japan has many of the same elements that you would find in Canada, that you would find.
Sounds like it's intensely private, really.
Yes.
In our sense, almost, that
yes.
You don't. We have a family basis too.
Yes.
And the interaction is limited.
Yes.
But it sounds actually not so much different in that sense from Canada, and both Japan and Canada sound different from a Latin American country or
yes.
a Mediterranean
yes.
country.
I would say, for me, going back to my experience, I believe my friends were mostly in the student house, in the boarding house where I stayed. I made friends with the people that I liked, and we went to different parties and different things together. But I didn't have the chance to introduce myself, to connect with Japanese people initially, because I was an English teacher, so I was the instructor in the context of the school where I worked. But there was one family that invited me to go to a restaurant, and we ate together. And there is definitely, I felt a guest in Japan. So in a positive sense, I felt I was a guest. So the expectations were rather limited, but they would want to take me to a restaurant or a cafe or something to leave a good impression, having a good impression of Japan and a good impression of the host people is very important to the Japanese. So I benefited from that.
So they think collectively in that sense.
Yes.
Not that they would say, I don't care, I'm not Japan.
That's right. And they will ask you, you know, do you like Japan? And it is important to say yes, or it's important to have some examples of things that you like about Japan. If you were to say no, that would not be received very well. That would be received with silence, and they would look down like this. So I think as a foreigner, at least as a Western foreigner, as long as I did not break any big rules, you know, like create a disturbance or vandalize, as long as I did not commit a crime or a major cultural offense, I was okay. But they didn't expect me to follow all of the customs and rules, because you're seen as being, they think that our culture is very unique and our culture is in the world very unique, so it's very difficult or perhaps impossible for a foreigner to understand our rules. So if you make a little mistake, it's no big deal. You're not expected to follow all of the...
Interesting. The other side of the